Tonight, we have 6 stories. From a tale of an elderly woman with a love for chickens, nightmares seeping into reality, parents acting strange, and much more. A huge thank you to the generous authors who have allowed me to share these stories with all of you. Please be sure to drop a like and comment if you enjoy. Subscribing if you're new is also very much appreciated. Enjoy the video, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. When I think of Miss Rossi, I like to think of her sitting in her garden on a hot July day. She's content and relaxed, watching the afternoon melt away, not a care in the world. And, of course, there are chickens everywhere. That's the only image I care to remember Miss Rossi by. I first met Miss Rossi through a friend of my mom's back in my hometown. Like many others lucky enough to graduate college in 2020, I'd been thrown headfirst into a non-existent job market and a country economically and ideologically ripped apart by a virus. I can't believe I'm even typing that out. It sounds like the beginning of a cheap dystopian novel. But anyway, there I was, fresh out of college with a useless creative writing degree, caught up in the time of Corona and rotting the summer away in my childhood home. I needed a way to occupy my time and make some extra cash. That's where Miss Rossi came in. Miss Rossi was old, lived alone, and needed a helper. Just someone to come by a few times a week to help her organize, tend to her garden, and take care of her chickens. Yes, chickens. In lieu of cats, Miss Rossi kept herself busy in solitary retirement by maintaining a flock of walking McNuggets. After a brief phone conversation with her, I was hired, and the next morning I found myself standing on the porch of a decrepit one-story bungalow across town. Faded yellow paint was curling off the shingled exterior, and overgrown trees and bushes gripped the house on all sides, as if slowly dragging it down into the earth. As I waited for Miss Rossi to answer, I noticed 3 young boys sitting parked on their bikes across the street. They couldn't be more than 10 or 11, and they stared at me with furrowed brows. I couldn't tell if they were angry, worried, or both. It was weird. Something about little kids when they're that age is terrifying. They're like a pack of dogs. Cute, but definitely could kill you if they tried. Then suddenly, their eyes widened and they scattered, hopping on their bikes and cruising down the street into the distance. "Hello?" An elderly woman's voice softly crooned. I turned. Standing in the open doorway was Miss Rossi herself. She was pretty tall for an old woman, and thin. Her face was wrinkly and true to her age, but when she smiled, her bright eyes exploded with such warmth and youth that I almost forgot she was in her late 80s. "You must be Eric," she cooed. She was honestly adorable. "Yeah, nice to meet you," I replied. She eagerly waved me through the front door and into the dark living room. Large indoor plants cluttered what would otherwise be a modest, geriatric abode. As we made our way through the room towards the kitchen, I realized the little trinkets placed around the room were all eggs. Wooden eggs, ceramic eggs, bejeweled eggs. It was like the world's biggest Faber egg collection. I guess everyone needs a hobby, I thought. "Let me show you the garden," she exclaimed, and a smile crossed her lips. She led me through a back door out onto a porch. As I stepped into the sunlight, my jaw dropped. Her garden was an oasis, a jungle of overgrown rosemary, lemon trees, bushes, tomato vines, and unidentifiable flowers that looked and smelled amazing. It was like the cover of a Better Homes and Gardens magazine on steroids. And most importantly, everywhere we walked there were chickens. They scampered amongst the shrubbery, pecked in the dirt, squawked and clucked at each other. Some had large, wrinkly red wattles that sagged down to their neck, and others were tiny, delicate, little balls of fluff. All different sizes, color, and breed of poultry seemed to live in this miniature jungle. They sleep in the coop over there when it gets dark, but I let them roam free all day. Sometimes I like to pull the rocking chair out here and just watch them. It's very soothing," Miss Rossi explained, pointing to a large red coop in the far corner. She snapped her fingers, and a group of hens ran up to her. They pecked at her feet and squawked, begging for food and bobbing their heads up and down like tiny zealots worshipping their giant granny deity. "Oh, I almost forgot." Miss Rossi snatched my hand and guided me to the far corner of the yard, where a large black compost bin sat amongst the thickets. "This is their food," she explained excitedly. "I just mix all my scraps together in here and throw a bucketful out for them. They love it. It's way better than that junk from the pet store. It has all the vitamins and minerals they need and keeps them strong and healthy." "Really? They just eat your leftovers?" "Oh yeah, of course. Chickens will eat anything." Over the next month, I went over to Miss Rossi's house 3 times a week. Each day was more or less the same. I'd arrive around 9 in the morning, take out her garbage, and clean and organize around the house. In the afternoons, I'd work in the yard raking leaves, cleaning the chicken coop, and feeding them piles of slop from the compost bin like Miss Rossi showed me. The chickens went crazy for it. They learned to associate me with food, and every time I walked into the garden, they'd come scampering up to me, begging for more mushy leftovers. As the weeks went on, I learned more and more about Miss Rossi. She had lived in that house for most of her adult life and started keeping chickens almost 50 years ago. When she first learned she couldn't have kids, her husband had died a few years ago, so the chickens were all she had left. They were her pride and joy, her surrogates. Healthy chickens were happy chickens, she always said. Miss Rossi was a strict vegan, with one major exception: the eggs that her own hens laid. In fact, each and every morning, Miss Rossi had exactly 3 eggs for breakfast. Fried, scrambled, poached, didn't matter. If her hens laid them, she would eat them. She claimed the eggs were the secret to her longevity. "They're the best, most nutritious eggs you'll ever have," she would say. "Happy chickens lay the best eggs, and I have the happiest chickens." And she was right. She was really right. On top of my normal pay, I got an added bonus of taking home a carton of eggs each week. The eggs came in a variety of colors: brown, white, green, even blue. Their yolks were a bright orange color, and the taste was immaculate. It feels weird raving about good-tasting eggs. I mean, they're just eggs, but I truly cannot emphasize just how good these eggs tasted. They were rich, buttery, and meaty. So good that sometimes I felt like I could just eat them raw. It was true what Miss Rossi said. Healthy chickens were happy chickens. Happy chickens lay the best eggs, and Miss Rossi had the happiest hens. However, another thing that quickly became a constant of that summer was the group of boys on their bikes. Just like on the first day, every morning those boys waited across the street, parked on their bikes, staring at Miss Rossi's house. At first it creeped me out, but after a while I ignored it. Kids are weird, and besides, I was too busy helping Miss Rossi to care. One afternoon after finishing up cleaning the coop, I went into the house to clean up. I carefully peeled the chicken shit stained gloves off my hands and walked down the hall towards the laundry room. The door was locked. Weird, I thought. I tried it again, but the knob didn't turn. Who locks a laundry room? Maybe I misremembered, and this was just another room. A special closet for nice linens or family heirlooms or something. But I could have sworn on the first day when Miss Rossi had shown me around the house, she told me this was the laundry room. Then again, she hadn't actually opened the door to show me. "Need something?" I whipped around. Miss Rossi was standing at the end of the hall, yawning, having just woken up from her afternoon nap. "Oh, sorry. This is the laundry room, right?" Miss Rossi cocked her head with amusement. She approached me with a smile on her face and gingerly grabbed the gloves from my hands. Oh, don't bother with that. If I had you doing my laundry, I'd have to pay you double, wouldn't I? She let out a sweet old lady laugh. I laughed too and went back out to the garden. I didn't think about the laundry room for the rest of the day. That evening, I walked home on my usual route. The sun was just starting to slide down the horizon, the last vestige of golden hour light warming my face as I strolled down the sidewalk. Then a voice cut through the silence. Stay away from her. I wheeled around. It was a boy. Can I help you? I breathed a sigh of relief, trying to mask my moment of genuine fear as mere annoyance. He took a step toward me. You have to listen to me, he pleaded. I looked the kid over. He was young, about 11, and grasping his bright blue mountain bike by the handlebars. I realized I recognized him from somewhere. Wait, you're one of those boys who's always outside Miss Rossi's house every morning, aren't you? What's your problem, huh? It's fucking weird, dude, you know that, right? You can't go back there, he blurted out. She's evil. I burst into laughter. This is why he and his little group of Stranger Things knockoff friends were spying on Miss Rossi. Please, you have to believe me. She took Timothy. Timothy? Who's Timothy? The words escaped my mouth between chuckles. Our friend. We were playing in the streets and he kicked a ball over Miss Rossi's fence into her yard. He went over to get it and he never came back. Went to retrieve a wayward ball and never returned. Very original. Like a more morbid version of The Sandlot or something. That's rich, kid. It's true. She kidnapped him. You have to believe me. Okay, enough. I scoffed. I wasn't amused anymore. She's an old woman that lives alone. She has no one. No husband. No kids. No one. I'm pretty sure the last thing she needs is a bunch of kids staring at her like she's some sort of sideshow act. Maybe if you actually try to talk to her one of these days, you'd know she's the sweetest person alive. She's literally harmless. I shook my head and started walking away. No one was going to come after Miss Rossi like that. Not the Miss Rossi I knew. No, please wait. You have to be careful. I kept walking. If you see a red kickball in the yard, can you bring it back? It was Timothy's. It has his initials on it. TS. TS for Timothy Sarkis. Sure, I yelled back sarcastically. I'm Jack, by the way. What's your name? I didn't respond or look back. I just kept walking. A few days later, I went back to Miss Rossi's, business as usual. Jack hadn't been waiting outside Miss Rossi's house when I arrived that morning, but his two other friends were. They probably were taking turns standing there on witch watch, or whatever it is they did. And yet, as I squatted in the garden pulling weeds, I couldn't help but think about what Jack said about his friend Timothy. What I thought was just juvenile superstition had some truth to it. I had done some research, and it turns out an 11-year-old boy named Timothy Sarkis did disappear about a year ago. Of course, there was no mention of Miss Rossi in anything I read. The actual suspect was a registered sex offender who lived down the street, and who died of a heart attack before police could investigate. There was absolutely nothing to even imply Miss Rossi had been involved, other than the fact that Timothy lived a few blocks away. In fact, the only thing I could find about Miss Rossi in a newspaper was her husband's old obituary. Miss Rossi was clearly just an obvious target for Timothy's friends to project their grief and confusion onto. She was old, eccentric, and lived alone in a ramshackle house, a perfect candidate for childhood superstition. What would Miss Rossi need with a young boy anyway? Besides, even if Timothy was last seen going into Miss Rossi's yard when he disappeared, someone would probably have mentioned that to the police. And then I saw it, out of the corner of my eye. A flash of red as I scanned the garden. I paused and focused on it. It looked like deflated rubber peeking out from behind a tangle of weeds and bushes, half buried in the soil. I had never noticed it before. Without thinking, I got up and walked across the garden towards it. I began to dig. Little by little, I uncovered more and more, the air slowly leaving my body as I held my breath, until finally, I unearthed the rest of it in one final pull, and the last ounce of oxygen I had flew out of my lungs. I went still, just staring at this thing I was now holding in my shaking, clammy hands. It was a kickball. A red kickball. A red kickball with TS written proudly in permanent marker on one side. If you see a red kickball in the yard, can you bring it back? It was Timothy's. It has his initials on it. TS. TS for Timothy Sarkis. Jack's words bounced back and forth between my ears. No. I stopped myself. Timothy had probably kicked his ball into Miss Rossi's yard, and when he went missing, the boys used it as a scapegoat to blame her for Timothy's disappearance. Yeah, that was it. It was just a coincidence. Most kickballs are red, and this was the suburbs. Kids kick balls into yards. Most kickballs are red. It's not weird. Kids kick balls into yards. TS. TS for Timothy Sarkis. No matter how hard I tried to shut out the doubt that was creeping into my brain, a single image popped into my head. A locked laundry room door. Miss Rossi had acted so flippant when she saw me trying to unlock it. Almost too flippant. Almost overcompensating. Maybe she was hiding something behind that door. Maybe it was Timothy. I sat there in the garden for a few moments, alone with Miss Rossi's chickens calmly strutting around the yard. The ever-present chirps of cicadas in the air seemed to grow louder and sharper, breaking out of the background noise and stinging my ears. Then I got up. I entered the house through the back door and crept down the hall towards the laundry room door. Miss Rossi was taking her usual afternoon nap on the recliner. I took a deep breath and gently tugged at the door handle. As expected, it was unlocked. I took my hand off the knob. This is dumb. I was being dumb. I should go back outside. Except, I knew where Miss Rossi kept all her keys. In the kitchen. In a drawer to the right of the sink. I knew where Miss Rossi kept everything because she trusted me, and I trusted her. But did I? What was behind that door? Why hadn't she told me what was on the other side? I tiptoed back into the kitchen, opened the drawer, and slowly pulled out the large key ring, holding the bundle of keys with my other hand to keep them from jangling. I made my way back into the hallway and brought the keys toward the door. There were so many, but I could rule a few out. One was for the backyard shed. One was for the front door. Another was for the car out front she never drove. I pulled out a small silver one and brought it into the lock. Didn't work. I singled out another one. A rusted gold one. It didn't fit either. I tried a third copper one. Suddenly the keys fumbled from my sweaty grip and I fell to the hardwood floor. A violent clang bounced off the walls of the silent house. I froze, waiting for Miss Rossi to wake up and hobble over with sweet curiosity like she so often does. What would she think? Would she be mad? Betrayed? But all was silent. Miss Rossi hadn't even stirred. I gently, very gently picked up the keys, silently scolding myself for being so careless. I put the last key in the lock. It worked. I pushed open the door and stepped inside, ready to breathe a sigh of relief as I found myself face to face with 2 GE laundry machines. But there were no laundry machines, no hampers, no piles of clothes, just a wooden staircase descending into a dark basement below. I took a step back. This was way above my pay grade. But I had to know what was down there. What if Jack was right? What if I found Timothy? I took a step down. Another. Then another, carefully shifting my weight on the creaky wooden stairs to make as little noise as possible until I reached the bottom. I took my final step onto the cold basement floor and my heart sank. To the right, Leaning against the wall was a pile of bicycles. Children's bicycles. Some new, some old, some so rusty they hardly looked like bicycles anymore. And there on top of the pile was a shiny, blue mountain bike. Jack's bike. The one he held by his side as he and his friends watched me walk up Miss Rossi's stoop each morning this summer. In that moment, I remembered he hadn't been there with his other friends this morning. In fact, the last time I saw him was a couple days ago, when he confronted me on the street, when he was warning me about Miss Rossi. There was a second door to the left on the other side of the basement. I turned and walked towards it. I don't even know what compelled me to walk towards it. I just did. There was no room in my head to think or process anything. I just had to see. I had to make sense of this. There had to be an explanation for this. There had to be. I reached the door and grabbed the handle. It wasn't even locked. It gave way so easily I practically flung myself into the room. The first thing I noticed was the bloodstains on the ground, stained into the gray floor like Rorschach blots. Then I saw the large hooks hanging from the ceiling. To my left, an industrial sink. To my right, a freezer. And at the far end, against the wall, a large, rectangular vessel with a tube coming out of the side feeding into a bucket. I'd never seen something like this in real life, but I knew instantly what it was. A meat grinder. And there, hanging above it, was a collage of newspaper cutouts. They were missing children notices, hundreds of blurry, smiling black and white faces from papers going back years and years. And above this twisted art project, like an idol at the top of a totem pole, hung a large metal frame picture of Miss Rossi and her husband, sitting on chairs in their garden, each of them holding two hens in their lap, while the rest of the flock gathered at their feet. I couldn't even begin to make sense of what I was looking at. All I could think about was the smell. Oh my God, the smell. It was a smell I had never smelt before, but a smell we all instinctively know to avoid, programmed into us through hundreds of thousands of years of evolution. The smell of death. This was definitely not a laundry room. This was a slaughterhouse. Now, what are you doing down here, dear? I went pale. Slowly, I turned around. It was Miss Rossi. Of course, it was Miss Rossi. Who else would it be? This was her house. Her charming, unassuming house. There she was, standing in the doorway, her hair in curlers, fresh from her nap, smiling at me with the sweet condescension of someone watching a dog chase its own tail. I opened my mouth to speak, but nothing came out. I stood there, staring at her in horror, the first waves of a panic attack about to wash over me. She just chuckled and opened her mouth. Well, I told you, didn't I? Chickens will eat anything. Miss Barry has always been a kind old woman, the type who'd say hello to you as you passed them in the street, or the type who snuck her grandchildren candy under the table when their parents weren't looking. She was there when my wife and I first moved into my home, being the first of the many in our cul-de-sac to welcome us into the neighborhood. I remember the first day I met her, with her long gray hair tied in a bun and a fresh apple pie in her hand as she stood outside our front door with a smile. Hello there, I'm your new neighbor, Jolene Barry, otherwise known as the neighborhood kook, Miss Barry. I own a bakery down the street. You're welcome to stop by any time for a free pastry. Something about her tone made you feel like you could share anything with her, and she would not judge. Her smile was warm and genuine, and it made you feel oddly safe. Thank you, we sure will. Would you like to come in for some tea? My wife responded whilst I unboxed some of the stuff into our new living room. I'd love to, she responded before briefly checking the time on her watch. I watched as the once warm smile quickly faded and turned into a cold, worrisome look before retracting her acceptance. saying something had come up and she had to reschedule. I watched as she scurried back to her own house, and right as she opened the door, I briefly saw a glimpse of what looked like a man in his 30s standing in the hall as she closed it behind her. Over the next few months, I came to learn that the man I had saw was Miss Barry's son. He still lived with her as he never could hold down a job for more than a year, and his mother was the only person who was willing to keep him around. He was known to be antisocial, and only left the house to go late-night casinos or the pub. I never really interacted with him, but when on the rare occasion our paths crossed, he never failed to make me feel uneasy. There were rumors that he was in huge amounts of debt due to his gambling addiction, and that his wife had left him because he tried to spend all her deceased parents' insurance money to fuel his addiction. One evening, we had Miss Barry over for dinner, and found ourselves talking and reminiscing about our childhood for hours. Miss Barry was mid-laughter when her smile suddenly widened, and she checked her watch, before mumbling to herself something about being late and excusing herself from the table to leave. Before we could ask what was wrong, she was out the front door and away home. What was that about? My wife asked as we stacked the plates and started unloading them into the dishwasher. I don't know. I was cut off from the sound of someone yelling. We attempted to locate where it was coming from, walking upstairs into our bedroom and watching through our window into one of the next door's rooms. That's when we saw Miss Barry and her son arguing in what looked like Miss Barry's bedroom. We couldn't make out full sentences, but from what I could decipher, it sounded as though her son was yelling about being late and how he lost something and needed to make it up somehow. Miss Barry seemed to be standing there like a lamb being helplessly mauled by a lion, and I couldn't help feel as though I needed to interfere. My wife stopped me though, and the voice quickly died down before stopping completely as we headed to bed. In the morning, I did my usual routine and began opening the curtains before nearly jumping out of my skin at the sight of Miss Barry greeting me at the window of her bedroom. She seemed to be sitting down on a chair facing the window, smiling at me. Something about this smile was different to her normal warm one, but I gave her a small smile and waved before continuing with my day and heading to work. I returned home late around 7 p.m., with the sun beginning to set, and my stomach rumbling loudly. Everything seemed to be normal up until I went to change out of my work clothes, only to discover Miss Barry at her window again. She was sitting in the chair, once again looking at me and smiling. I began to feel unnerved as I gave her a confused wave, waiting for her to return one. She never did, continuing to stare at me. I went downstairs and alerted my wife of what was going on, before both of us going back to the scene and being equally weirded out. This brings us to now, as I sit typing this. It's been around an hour since, and Miss Barry still hasn't moved. And the more I go to check if she's still there, the more I'm starting to realize that she hasn't blinked once. I'm unsure if these entities have another name, but I've always referred to them as static men. When I was a young child, I remember waking up late in the middle of the night. I was fast asleep, blanketless on a round, woven rug that laid midway along the wood panel wall of my aunt's living room. Half asleep and growing chilly, I reached around for a blanket that wasn't there. I believe it was then I heard the muffled voices and noticed the pale, eerie glow of static flickering from the old television. The light from the television painted the room in weakened and sickly hues of greens and blues, still half washed with sleep. I was able to see my uncle asleep in his recliner from across the room. I heard the muffled voices again and assumed it was my parents arguing. Not wanting to get into trouble for being awake, I kept my eyes slightly closed while pretending to be fast asleep. The muffled voices seemed closer, and yet still unintelligible. I start to become afraid and want to run to my uncle for comfort, or at the very least have him change the channel, because the voices I heard sounded even closer, and were coming from not my parents but the old television. Peeking as a child pretending to be asleep, I faced the television and saw them. The strange silhouettes of staticky figures on the screen, noticeably appearing more defined than the chaotic jittering of the background. They moved on naturally, fading softly from one moment to the next. They stood there watching us from just beyond the glass, no longer speaking, just eerily watching quietly. It was a while before I became aware of the air becoming electrically charged, with a smell I know now is ozone. As the television flickered off for the last time, there was no transition from when the television went out to when he appeared in front of it. He was accompanied by a low idling hum, similar to fluorescent light, that was more felt than heard. I closed my eyes tightly, hoping to fool this strange figure out of desperation as I slowly wept out of fear. The hair on my skin raised with a prickling sensation as I felt him walk past me. Forcing myself to peek again, I watched this strange silhouette-like entity through my watery eyes. For several moments he stood in front of my uncle, distorting and scrambling himself, slowly fine-tuning every detail and unnaturally becoming his identical, except mirroring every noticeable feature in muted, unnatural hues. I watched horrified as my uncle faded into the nothingness before me. As this strange thing took his place, unable to control myself, I frantically sat up and erupted loudly into tears, hoping it was just a bad dream. He, this creature now my uncle, turned from where he stood, looking down expressionless at me, while I uncontrollably sobbed, and simply walked out of the room. I sat there fearfully crying in the dim room, unknowing what to do, while listening to the same unintelligible voices being heard again from elsewhere in the house. I saw her in a dream, or at least that's what I thought. When I was really young, maybe 7 or 8, I couldn't really tell you what the dream was about, but I vividly remember waking up terrified, my eyes flying open and looking up at the ceiling, expecting the cloudscape my father had painted, but instead being met with her face. It took up the whole ceiling, like she ripped off the roof of my house and stuck her head inside. Her black hair floated around the room like it was submerged in water, her dark eyes staring at me blankly, her mouth gaping open like she was trying to call for help. I thought I was still dreaming, so I screamed, trying to wake myself up, but it just woke my parents. My father was at my side before I knew it, and the woman's face was gone, her hair retracting into the ceiling as my dad tried to soothe my tears. That first occurrence was about 2 decades ago, and the woman has been a regular occurrence in my dreams since. I started mentally calling her Meredith because the weird lady that looks like a drowning victim that haunts my dreams was getting to be a little tiring. Granted, I never really spoke of Meredith to anyone. She was mostly my little secret, and she never did any harm to me. She wasn't even in the forefront of my dreams. I'd see her black, matted mop of hair in the middle of a crowd or a photo of her in my dreams somewhere. But she was never as close or as aggressive as she was the first time I'd seen her so many years ago. That was until I moved in with my fiancé. Tom really wanted to move in together, but I'll be honest when I say that I didn't feel ready, but I felt too pressured not to. The first night I stayed in the new apartment with him was full of awful night terrors, scenes of drowning girls and hideous sea creatures every time I closed my eyes. I thought it was because I knew that I didn't want to be laying in bed next to Tom, so I decided that I needed space and got up to get a glass of water. I fumbled around in the dark, trying my best not to wake him, but I failed miserably, or so I thought. Behind me, I heard the door creak open. I expected to see Tom's salt and pepper hair shining in the moonlight, but was met with Meredith. She was standing in the doorway, her hair dripping wet, lips blue, waterlogged skin. I didn't know what to do. I was stunned. I had never seen her whole body before, and never realized how much she looked like me. I didn't know if I was seeing things or still dreaming. I opened my mouth to scream, but just as quickly as I opened my mouth, Meredith placed a finger over hers to shush me. She removed her finger from her lips and raised both of her hands in surrender, taking slow steps toward me. I could hear Tom rolling around in the bedroom behind her, and I was starting to get worried. I knew he was a light sleeper and wasn't sure what would happen if he woke up. Every few steps, Meredith would look back toward the bedroom, like she knew he was easily awoken too. When she was close enough to me to whisper, she opened her mouth. A small amount of water escaped her lips, followed by a cough. Tom rolled in his sleep again. We both looked toward the bedroom door. Nothing. Still asleep. A sigh of relief. I didn't know why I was so scared. Would he even see Meredith if he woke up? My eyes still on the door, I felt a cold, clammy hand cupping mine. I instinctively pulled my hand back, but Meredith took my hand again. I met her eyes, and in response, she looked down. She opened her mouth again, and more water left it, splattering against the linoleum floor. She choked out a single word. Look. She released my hand and held hers next to it. The engagement rings we bore on our fingers were identical. Shocked, I brought my hand to my mouth, stifling a gasp. In the bedroom, Tom moved again and again and again. He was waking up and getting out of bed. I looked at the bedroom door and then back at Meredith, but she was gone. I looked back at the bedroom door. Tom was standing in the doorway, scratching his head. What are you doing up? Oh, I couldn't sleep. I was getting something to drink. Tom moved over to me, arms wide, ready to embrace me. His warm grip was a massive change from Meredith's cold clasp. But just as fast as Tom wrapped his arms around me, he jumped back, lifting his foot. What the hell, Lauren? You spill water all over the floor or something? Stunned for a second, realizing Meredith wasn't just a figment of my imagination, I could feel my eyes widen. Lauren? Tom cocked his head to the side. Shaking my head, trying to recompose myself, I said, Yeah, my bad. I'll just meet you back in bed. Tom furrowed his brow for a moment before his features softened again. He kissed me and headed back into the bedroom, flopping himself back onto the bed. I sighed in relief, looking around the room, hoping to see Meredith again, but she was gone. I didn't sleep at all that night, knowing what I knew now. When Tom left for work the next morning, I packed everything I could fit in my car and left. I was so set on getting out of that apartment, I didn't realize I still had the ring on my finger. In a panic, I threw it out the window halfway down the interstate. In my rearview mirror, I saw Meredith, along with several other young women that looked just as disheveled as her, smiling at me. Have you ever had someone you were close with change suddenly, almost as if they were a completely different person? That's exactly what happened to my parents when I got back from college last year for summer break. My parents were usually a bit distant, but they always made sure to keep in contact with me when I left for each semester, as we were still quite close otherwise. When it neared the end of the semester, they didn't call or message me as they usually did. It was weird, but nothing suspicious or worrying. I assumed that they probably just had a lot going on at work. That is, until I got home that summer. The front lawn was very overgrown and browning, which was something my father rarely let happen. He was a gardener after all. He wouldn't be caught dead with an ugly, disgraceful lawn. On top of that, the potted plants near the front door were all wilted and dying. Once I had gotten inside my childhood home, it felt so off that it didn't feel as if it was. So much so that I leaned back out from the door to check the address once more just in case. It was the right address, but it didn't feel like it. It didn't feel as welcoming as it always did when I got home. There was no scent of lavender filling the air from Mom's candles she had lit almost 24/7. The once comforting and calm forest surroundings felt almost eerie and unwanting of my presence. My 6-year-old tabby cat hadn't welcomed me the moment I opened the door. and neither had my parents. "Mom, Dad, I'm back," I shouted, hoping for some sort of reply as my voice echoed throughout the seemingly empty house. The entire kitchen and living room was very neat, as if nobody really used anything or it was just a staged room used in a furniture store. For just a moment, a feeling deep within my gut telling me to leave began to radiate throughout my body, but I quickly shoved it away. Besides, this was the home I grew up in. It was a safe place. At least a minute or two after I called out to my parents, they both walked through the hallway towards the kitchen in unison. The instant I saw them, it caused me to jump out of my skin slightly as they hadn't made a single sound as they walked over. Usually I would hear the creaks within the floorboards or the scraping of my mother's wooden chair upstairs in her office. Once they saw me with my heart racing against my chest violently, they smiled at me, but it wasn't their usual sweet and caring ones. It made me feel a weird, unsettling feeling, almost as if you saw a random man smiling at you from an alley in the dark in the night. Just creepy. It caused that gut feeling within me to come up once more. "We've been waiting for you, dear," my mother said in a sickly sweet voice that made me inwardly cringe. My parents never called me nicknames. They always used my full name. And my mother had never talked to me as if I were a child, even when I was a child. All of it was unnerving me and overloading my senses. It was too much for me to unpack nor handle after a 5-hour trip from my college campus. I told them I was tired and just wanted to go rest for a bit. They hadn't even replied to my statement. From what I can recall, they simply just stepped backwards to make room for me to walk past them, their stare never faltering from me, not even a blink. I felt their burning glare bore holes into my back as I made my way down the hallway and up the stairs. I felt as if they were still on me even when I wasn't around them in my own room. I was tired enough to just toss my luggage beside my bed, crawl under the covers, and pass out without another thought of how out of place everything felt. I woke up to complete darkness surrounding me. The only light came from the hall. As I tried my best to gain some semblance of sight within the dark, I sensed the scorching feeling of eyes burning into me. The moment I glanced towards my doorway, I almost leaped from my bed, as I saw a black figure standing within my doorframe. Another dark figure caught my eye, standing in the corner of my room. Maybe it was the darkness that made it all so unsettling, or maybe it was the fact that deep down I knew the people in my room weren't my parents. They just didn't have the same professional yet caring aura that always radiated from within them. Instead, they felt hostile and dangerous. It was almost like how you would most likely feel if you were to fall within the cage of a predatory zoo animal. I'm not sure how long I even laid there, letting the oddly heavy sounds of my parents' breathing fill the room uncomfortably. I only realized I'd been holding my breath once I tried to speak. The sound that came out was simply just a gasp for air, but the moment it came from my mouth, the shadow in the corner of my eye that stood in my room began making its way towards me slowly. Its movements were excruciatingly slow, causing the floorboards to creak and draw out longer than they should. "Darling, should you not be sleeping?" The shadow nearing me spoke. It was my mother's voice, but it also wasn't. It was laced with malintent and an overbearing sense of false sweetness. "Midnight is waiting for you. We want to take you to him," said the shadow still standing like stone in the doorway. Midnight was the name of my cat. A cat I hadn't seen once since I had been home, which would have been one of the weirder things if it wasn't for my parents being more so. She was being a bad cat, so we had to punish her, stated my father seriously. His words caused my heart to plummet deeply into my stomach at his implication. "Get rid of her," growled my mother, a wicked grin slowly pulling a giant at the corner of her lips. "Now you'll join her," spat my father as he began to lunge for me, his mouth spread open wider than humanly possible. I could easily fit inside in one gulp, not touching a single sharpened tooth that laid within his mouth. I quickly moved aside clumsily, knocking into the wall, hitting my head harshly. My action caused my father to fall onto my bed, letting out a deep and horrid scream of rage. The sound was something that could make even the most hardened person's blood run ice cold. The way it echoed against the small room's walls and somehow rattled my bones. It was enough to make me rush towards my mother, who now stood near the doorway, pushing her as hard as I could aside. She apparently wasn't expecting me to do such a thing, as she stumbled over into my dresser, causing everything to fall over with her. I pumped my legs with vigor as I ran down the stairs fast enough for me to almost trip down them. The moment I reached the landing of the first floor, an almost unbearable scent consumed the once tense air. The smell was almost rotten, but it was even more disgusting and indescribable than that. When I thought back to when I came home, I didn't remember smelling anything close to that. If I did, I would have easily remembered it, even if I didn't want to. I could hear both my parents' footsteps heavily dragging against the floorboards above. They began talking in sync, their voices deep and warped in an utterly unsettling manner. "We love you. We need you. Come here, darling," they said together as they continued their way towards the stairs slowly. Their voices seemed to fill the entire house, bellowing against every wall no matter how far away they were. I just sprinted towards the door, their footsteps beckoning sharp creaks from within the staircase and their almost mocking voices continuing relentlessly. The moment I tried the door handle, I heard their footsteps quicken down the stairs. "That's not where Midnight is. She's within us now, and you will be too," they shouted darkly in unison, their pounding footsteps taunting my ears cruelly. The door was locked. They locked the door and I didn't have the key. I never thought the old doorknob that needed a key to lock the outside and inside was stupid and odd until that moment. There was no way a stupidly made door was going to get me killed. As soon as the idea of just breaking through the window filled my mind, I felt my entire body being pushed with immense power across the room and over the kitchen counter. The pain that filled me was intense enough to trick me into truly believing that I broke every bone within my small body. I could hear their laughs slamming against my ringing ears as they grew closer to me. I tried as best as I could to break out of my pain-induced daze, slowly getting up to get my bearings, to see how hard I had to fight and run to get to my escape. "And we should put her out of her misery. Tasty thing," offered my mother. As soon as I locked eyes with her, I knew for sure she wasn't who she seemed to be. The hunger that flowed within her dark eyes were impossible to miss. The way she looked at me like a new meal as she licked her lips smiling. Once they got close enough to me, but not close enough to grab, I crawled a bit and then pushed myself up with all the strength I had left to race for my exit. Their horrific screams of anger filled my ears once again, their feet slamming against the floor quickly now. Once I felt seething pain against my scalp and the feeling of vicious hands pulling at my hair, I kicked the assaulter behind me. The moment my foot made contact with their stomach, a manly grunt came from them, causing them to let go of my locks. I took my well-earned chance, grabbing the stone statue of a horse that sat on the table beside the window. I smashed the statue against the thin glass, tossing it through as the pane shattered. I didn't even think about the leftover glass shards still sticking out from the window as I pushed myself through. I felt glass pierce the delicate skin against my feet and hands, but I didn't care. I just ran. I ran as hard and as fast as I could, leaving my luggage and my car behind me. I didn't dare to look behind me once as the ominous, corrupted sounds of my parents shouting threats at me filled the night air. I may have been extremely close with my family all my life, but after that night, I never contacted them again. I called the police on them, mostly hoping that they would be able to get them the help they desperately need and calm them down. I'm not sure if the news I got from the police officers were comforting, upsetting, or just disturbing. Because once they entered my parents' home, they found both of them dead in the basement. They told me that it was estimated that they had been down there for over a month. Once they told me the news, I knew for sure whoever those people were not my parents. It's been a year and I'm finishing my last semester of college. I still have nightmares and sometimes I even think I see them, hiding in the trees when I'm taking runs on the hiking trail near campus. Sometimes I can still just feel their hot stare burning my skin, even inside. If you ever have a gut feeling that something is immensely off, listen to it. It knows better than you ever could, or else you may not get the chance I did to escape the consequences. When I was in second grade, I moved to a new school on the other side of the country. I'm not talking about horizontally where there is at least some sense of familiarity. Instead, I was whisked from sunny, urban Florida to cold, seaside Maine. Of course, I protested this action, but my parents kept telling me, "It's fun, it's a new start. Aren't you excited to meet some new people?" Well, they tried to convince me that the stunning views would be worth it. All I could think about was how little phoneless me would lose everyone she's ever known. Eventually, we moved. I was still upset about the move, but I will admit that the views from the rocky cliffs were as stunning as my parents insisted they were. The town itself was a plus as well. It was a small fishing town, with a wooded suburban section in the hills, and a downtown area down by the docks. The downtown area did remind me somewhat of home, although it was filled with mom and pop stores instead of Starbucks. However, I was always more of a shy girl, so I preferred to spend time in the woods or down by the empty beaches with my face dug deep into a book. So, imagine my shock when I head down to the beach to read, and I find two boys sitting on the sandy grass, deep in conversation. They both stopped their conversation, eyeing me before averting their gaze towards the small blue book cradled in my arms. "You like Harry Potter too?" said the pale boy closest to me. After responding with a timid yes, the two invited me to come over. I was hesitant at first, but as the conversation progressed, I started to warm up to them. I found out that the thin boy that invited me over was named Matt, while his white-haired friend went by the name Jacob. We talked about everything under the sun that day, from the town to school, the books that filled our heads, and bookshelves. We talked until the cloudy gray sky gave way to dark clouds on the horizon. We decided to head home, but not before swapping Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets for a hardcover of Flora and Ulysses, and vowing to meet there tomorrow. We spent that summer climbing the rocky hills, canoeing out into the harbor, getting in joking debates on why our favorite book was the greatest of all time, and attempting to sway each other's opinion with the nonsensical logic only a second grader could possess. Eventually, we made it to high school. We were probably seen as the weirdo book nerds, but we didn't care. We were too busy getting wrapped up in Agatha Christie, Harper Lee, and our own stupid conversations to notice. However, while we barely noticed the changing social statuses around us, we easily noticed changes in each other. It started out small, with Jacob asking, "Hey, where'd you get that necklace?" I turned to look and notice it for the first time. It wasn't much, just a key. Even then, the key wasn't at all that exciting. It looked like a simple skeleton key, old enough to have a rustic charm, but not very ornate either. It also didn't look new. The key varied between states of slate and brown, with some signs of rust and a faint bronze shine emanating from the places time had worn away. Matt stared down at it for several seconds before replying, "It's not a necklace, it's a key." Jacob, seemingly wanting more than the nonchalant answer, added, "A key too?" He shrugged before responding, "Nowhere." Knowing that he probably wasn't going to get any other information from him, he returned to our conversation on analyzing Fahrenheit 451 and gossiping about how the popular high school couple was going to break up once she found out about their affair. Everything was normal. Then Matt changed. He became colder, more distant. His grades fell, his face covered with stubble, and his normally semi-formal attire morphed into jeans and a sweatshirt. Worst of all, he withdrew from us. No more conversation in the lunchroom. No more book club meetings in the library. No more hangouts at the pier. Nothing. One day, Jacob told me to meet him in the hallway after school, claiming that it was urgent. I met him there as soon as the bell struck 3. He was sitting in his usual spot, looking on the verge of a mental breakdown. I threw my book bag aside before taking my own seat and asking, "What's wrong?" He looked up at me, tears fighting for release from his dark brown eyes, and he whispered, "You need to help Matt." I looked at him, stunned before asking what he meant. "Well, he's acting depressed. I know you've seen it." I looked at him quizzically. Having known Jacob as long as I have, I knew him inside and out. I also knew when he was lying. What else happened? I could see that he was hesitant to tell me, but he sighed and whimpered. I tried to talk to him, to see what was wrong. He started yelling at me, yelling about how I had no life, how I was just filling my head with useless mumbo-jumbo words that would get me nowhere in life. Then he walked off. At that, he broke down, floodgates bursting from inside those dark brown eyes. I hugged him tightly, and the two of us walked down to an abandoned part of the pier where I stayed until those same dark clouds started heading in our direction. I bade him farewell and we split off, him to his place, and me to see Matt. I knew he'd be there. Of course, he'd be at the same isolated beach where we first met in 3rd grade. He was just sitting there, facing away from me, black hoodie poorly covering his disheveled hair and 5 o'clock shadow. I silently sat next to him and turned to face the shell of my friend. "Why are you here?" he asked, not even turning to meet my gaze. "What's going on?" Of course, he gave me that BS answer of nothing, and stood to leave, but I blocked his path. "You aren't okay. Look at you. You're acting like you don't even know us. What's going on?" "Nothing." He tried pushing past me again, but I stood my ground. Finally, he broke. He told me about his home life, how his parents won't stop fighting, how kids at school would harass him, and how his older brother would make their taunts seem like compliments. His brother would hit him with a belt, lock him outside in the frigid air, and waterboard him while cackling like a banshee. How his parents would just blow it off as boys will be boys. He moved on to a worldview: war, plagues, famine, anything and everything. It just seems like everything is wrong in the world. Then it was my turn. I consoled him, told him everything would be all right, that we would confront his family together, how he would fix this and make it right again. We could have his brother reported, take him to see a therapist, and everything would be okay. And he looked me in the eyes. For the first time that night, his steel gray eyes looked with mine, and we were suddenly in 2nd grade again. Those steel gray eyes were the same eyes that sparkled with vitality and wonder, that spent all summer climbing the rocky hills and canoeing out in the harbor, and getting in joking debates on why our favorite book was the greatest of all time and attempting to sway each other's opinions with the nonsensical logic only a 2nd grader could possess. Those steel gray eyes that gave me his copy of Flora and Ulysses. Those steel gray eyes that invited me to sit with him on this very beach years ago. And then, it was gone. His eyes dimmed, and the shell was back. "No," he said, turning to leave. "You can't help me." I watched him walk away from that beach. I watched him behind the rocks and hills where the old hymn would have played. I watched him go. I saw him one last time. I immediately went to Jacob's house. He had to know what was actually going on with Matt. That isn't right. What his brother's doing, it isn't right. Jacob mused the idea after I told him what happened on the front step of his house. Then, his hopeless expression turned serious. He stormed inside before coming out with his father's digital camera. "We need to catch him in the act, get proof, then we can fix things." The two of us ran as fast as our scrawny selves could take us to Matt's house. When we finally reached the secluded building, we were panting and out of breath. Using the spare key in the flower pot, we tiptoed inside. The house was dark. It appeared that Matt and his older brother were home alone. The perfect opportunity for us to get proof. We tiptoed upstairs, trying doors to find his room. The first one was obviously his parents' room. A king-size bed sat pressed up against the wall. Nightstands lay crooked, or toppled over on either side, and a grease-covered rug sat at the main walkway. Plastic bottles and empty chip bags littered the floor. We quickly left that room and moved to the next one. The second room was his brother's, and it was in a worse state than his parents'. His bed was also pressed against the wall. Although the unmade bed, unwashed sheets, and broken headboard were different, dirty clothes lay strewn across the room, and there was even a foul-smelling t-shirt hanging from a lazily spinning ceiling fan. The final room was locked, and we could hear a soft dripping inside. I remember the waterboarding and immediately panicked. Taking one of the bobby pins out of my hair, I bent it straight and inserted it into the small hole at the bottom of the door frame. After adjusting the position several times, I heard the lock give with a small click. My hand was on the handle. Jacob had his camera at the ready. We were doing this. With a jolt, I thrust the door inwards while Jacob started spamming the shutter button. Bright flashes filled the room one after the other. It was only after they stopped that we saw what was actually inside. His brother was hanging from the ceiling. He was gutted, with his eyes gouged out and his stomach leaking fluids onto the floor in a constant dripping. Jacob screamed a primordial wail that echoed off of the walls and combined with the now pouring rain. My own scream was caught in my throat as I stared, not at the body, but at the pictures surrounding him. They were bad as if they were drawn by a 5-year-old, but I could clearly see their contents. It was a Lovecraftian underworld, as incomprehensible as it was terrifying. There appeared to be eyes growing off of trees, houses covered in skin and teeth. Some of it was incoherent scribbles, but I feared those as much as I feared the ghastly contents. But in all of them was Matt, smiling, standing with one arm clutching that key and another waving to us as if he were on vacation. I noticed words, written in pencil. I leaned closer to read them, and in a flash they seemed to snap into focus. Missing you all. Hope you can come to visit me. I promise. Nowhere is much better than the outside world. Then I started screaming too. The police arrived shortly after. We didn't even need to call. Someone had been walking by and heard screams coming from inside the house. We were suspects, of course, but our stories matched with camera recordings at the front door and hallway of the house. Everyone knew that it was Matt. There was no other person it could have been, but it didn't matter. Matt was never seen again after that day. His family ended up divorcing, and both left the town in search of bigger and better things. Nobody blames them. I'd leave too. Jacob and I both dropped out of high school and decided to take online courses together. We'd work together at the pier, or in the woods, or at one of the mini cliffs in this small town. We never went back to the beach. Too many memories. We'd rather leave forgotten. Eventually, we graduated online. We both got accepted into separate colleges, but we kept in touch afterwards. People would always ask us, "How did you manage to work out a long-distance relationship?" We say that it's just childhood friends sticking together or something like that. We don't tell them the truth. I think we both thought that if we pretended that it never happened, then it never did. But something happened, and I don't think the past can stay hidden much longer. It started when I woke up unexpectedly. My sorority bed wasn't necessarily comfortable, but not uncomfortable enough that I would just randomly wake up. I looked at the bright red 2:10 of my alarm clock and shifted over to try and get some sleep. That was when I saw him. It was horrifying. Its legs were elongated, as if it had several more joints in there than needed. Its arms were thick compared to its near-emaciated frame, ending in pulpy paws rather than hands, and caving-in eyes that glowed in various shades of silver, crimson, and pale yellow. Its ribs were exposed, revealing a crisscrossing web of bones that exposed tree roots, and its spine had several other bones jutting out of it. Its skin was clear and shiny, as if it was flayed. Its jaw was extended like an animal. Its nose was gone, revealing the empty, fleshy socket. Its upper jaw was covered in 15 differing rows of teeth, and its lower jaw was broken in half to form fleshy mandibles. Its eyes were gouged out, leaking fluid onto the floor. It screamed, a primal yowl that finally snapped me out of my shock. I screamed, our two voices melding until my bedroom door slammed open. My sorority sisters tried to comfort me, but it wasn't working. I was in high school again. I was in Matt's room. I was staring into the empty sockets of Matt's older brother. I told no one what I saw. I know I'm going to tell Jacob, but no one else can know. They'd write me off as crazy, but I know I'm not crazy. I know that what I saw was real. You may sit back and try to explain whatever you think is happening, but if what I saw was fake, then how can you explain the very distinct, bloody key I found at the foot of my bed?